March 23, 1945, 9 p.m. The western bank of the Rhine River, near Wesel, Germany. Through his shaking binoculars, Lieutenant Wilhelm Steinberg scanned the dark waters, jotting notes into a field journal that Allied forces would later find among captured German documents. "The Americans have reached our sacred river," he wrote, "but they can't cross. No army ever has." As night fell, flashes of artillery lit the horizon, thousands of guns firing from the western bank. To German commanders, it all looked familiar. The start of a traditional river assault. Days of bombardment, then slow bridge building, then waves of soldiers crossing at points the 88s could tear apart. For 2,000 years, the Rhine had shielded Germany. And even now, as the Reich collapsed, its engineers swore the river's width and current made any crossing impossible without weeks of preparation. But across the water, 2,000 men from the 51st Highland Division were getting ready. They weren't using fragile assault boats or waiting for engineers to build pontoon bridges under fire. They had something entirely different. Machines the Germans had seen before, but completely misunderstood. The Allies called them ducks, odd boat-shaped trucks the Germans had dismissed as beach toys for Normandy landings. They had no idea that these amphibious vehicles would rewrite the rules of river warfare. The Rhine, their uncrossable moat, was about to become a highway, thanks to American industrial genius that no one in German intelligence had taken seriously. That failure had begun months earlier. General Gunther Blumentritt, chief of staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, later admitted that the Wehrmacht never truly grasped what the Americans were capable of. Reports from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy described swimming trucks, but analysts filed them under curiosities, right next to ice cream ships and Coca-Cola battalions. Among the defenders on the Rhine was Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model. His diary, later captured, revealed how confident the Germans had been. To them, river crossings were governed by unbreakable laws, overwhelming artillery, heavy bridges, and most of all, time. Time for the defenders to zero in and destroy any crossing. But when Allied troops captured German headquarters, they found reports that mentioned the duck just 3 times in 6 months, each time dismissing it as irrelevant. Intelligence officers estimated there were maybe 100 of them in Europe. In truth, there were over 2,000. The Allies had entire amphibious truck companies, each with 50 ducks and trained crews who'd been practicing river crossings since Normandy. The British had another 2,000 through Lend-Lease, and the Canadians used 800, specially modified for cold weather. The duck was a masterpiece of American problem-solving. It was born not on a battlefield, but on a sandbar off Massachusetts in 1942, when a Coast Guard boat ran aground and ordinary trucks couldn't reach it. That tiny problem sparked an idea. What if a truck could drive straight into the sea and back out again? Engineer Palmer C. Putnam teamed up with yacht designer Rod Stevens, Jr. and mechanical genius Dennis Pulliston to make it happen. Ford said it was impossible. GM said, "We'll do it." 38 days later, the first duck rolled out. It combined a standard GMC 2.5-ton truck with a watertight hull, a propeller, and the world's first central tire inflation system, allowing drivers to change tire pressure on the move. Low for sand and mud, high for pavement. It could cruise at 5.5 knots in water and roll seamlessly onto land. By war's end, GM had built over 21,000 of them, a machine that cost 7 times more than a Jeep, but would prove priceless. Meanwhile, on the Rhine, the German First Parachute Army was a ghost of its former self. 90,000 men had been lost in the Reichswald battles. Their replacements were old men and boys, barely trained, armed with captured weapons, and wearing armbands instead of uniforms. One German soldier wrote home on March 20th, "The Americans are across from us now. We hear their engines day and night. But the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon couldn't cross it under fire. They believed it. They had destroyed the bridges and registered every crossing point for artillery fire. On paper, their defense looked unbreakable. For months, hundreds of thousands of civilians had labored to reinforce bunkers and fortifications. 3,000 concrete positions dotted the riverbanks. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that the Allies weren't coming over the Rhine the old way. They were about to roll straight across it.
The Rhine itself was everything German military doctrine dreamed of, the perfect water barrier. Too wide for assault bridges, too deep to ford, and far too swift for boats. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who'd just taken command after von Rundstedt's dismissal, summed up German confidence in one chilling order. The enemy will need 48 to 72 hours to establish any real bridgehead. That's when we'll counterattack. But those mobile reserves he spoke of, just 150 functioning tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers stretched thin across nearly 200 miles of front. And the real weakness wasn't the numbers, it was the mindset. German doctrine treated river crossings as step-by-step affairs: suppress with artillery, send in infantry on assault boats, build fragile bridgeheads under fire, then construct bridges piece by piece before armor could move across. Every phase gave defenders precious time to regroup and strike back. What they didn't realize was that the Allies had thrown out the entire playbook. Along the western bank of the Rhine, hidden in forests and villages, sat the largest collection of amphibious vehicles ever assembled in history. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs were lined up within 5 miles of their launch points, waterproofed, inspected, and carefully balanced with cargo so they'd stay steady in the current. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company later recalled, "This wasn't Normandy, no tides, no beaches. This was about current, exit points, and timing our moves so we didn't end up under our own artillery. We'd practiced for weeks on the Meuse River, learning how to handle those ducks in fast water." These weren't stock DUKWs anymore. After 3 years of combat upgrades, they were armored, armed, and hardened. Steel plating protected drivers and engines, 50 caliber mounts give them bite, and powerful bilge pumps could keep them afloat even after being riddled with bullets. Captain James Mitchell from the 819th Amphibious Truck Company remembered the final briefing vividly. "They told us straight, we were about to do something no army had ever done before. We weren't bringing supplies. We were the assault." Each DUKW would carry a full rifle squad, 12 men plus the 2-man crew. They'd cross the Rhine, climb the far bank, and drop soldiers directly into battle positions. No waiting, no bridges, no delays. The British were ready too. Under Major General Percy Hobart, the 79th Armored Division had brought 600 LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each capable of carrying 30 troops. Together with the American DUKWs, they formed the backbone of what would become the largest amphibious river crossing in history. At 5 p.m. on March 23rd, the sky erupted. Over 4,000 Allied guns, from small 25-pounders to massive 240-millimeter howitzers, unleashed a storm so violent it turned the air itself into metal and fire. German observers said the eastern bank looked like it was boiling. One, a young soldier named Gerhard Müller, tried to count the flashes across the river. He later wrote, "I stopped at 500. It looked like a solid line of fire stretching as far as I could see. The noise wasn't explosions anymore. It was one endless roar that swallowed every thought." Then, under the cover of that thunder and darkness, the first DUKWs slid into the Rhine at 9 p.m. sharp. The 51st Highland Division led the charge, the 7th Battalion Black Watch, packed into Amtraks operated by Americans. 12 men per vehicle, plus the 2-man crew. Their navigation lights were dimmed, visible only from behind. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the Black Watch remembered the moment their wheels left the riverbank. We rolled down the slope, the engine roared, and suddenly we were floating.
The American driver just kept going, like he was still on a road instead of a river. Water surged around us, waves slapping the hull, the engine roaring so loud we could barely hear ourselves think. German shells splashed all around, but the smoke and darkness hid everything. The Rhine's current was far stronger than expected, 8 to 10 knots through the main channel. Each DUKW had launched slightly upstream, its driver calculating drift like a pilot correcting for crosswinds. Some got swept hundreds of yards off course, but that didn't matter. These machines could climb out almost anywhere. As long as the bank had a slope, they could drive straight out of the water and keep going. By 10 o'clock that night, the first wave was already across. German troops on the far side waited for the familiar rhythm, boats returning for the second wave. But none came. The DUKWs didn't come back. They'd driven straight up the eastern bank and vanished into the night, their passengers already fighting deep behind German lines. When dawn broke on March 24th, German headquarters started getting reports that made no sense. Enemy soldiers were appearing miles inland, in full battalion strength, armed with mortars, machine guns, even anti-tank weapons. The expected bridgeheads, those small, fragile footholds, didn't exist. The Allies were everywhere at once. One battery commander, Captain Karl Reichelt, radioed in from near Ries. "Enemy armor is behind us. Repeat, enemy armor is behind us. All bridges destroyed. No pontoon construction observed." But what his men had seen weren't tanks at all. They were DUKWs, loaded with infantry support weapons, mortars, and anti-tank guns, driving straight from the river into battle 3 miles inland. Because these amphibious trucks could come ashore anywhere, they bypassed strong points that had been carefully positioned to defend the obvious crossing routes. When the morning fog finally lifted, the sheer scale of the operation became clear. Hundreds of DUKWs were streaming across the Rhine in constant motion. Unlike assault boats, which needed engineers and fixed launch points, the DUKWs didn't care where they entered or exited. German observers stared in disbelief. The swimming trucks were crossing at dozens of spots along a 20-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 185th Division wrote in his diary, "The enemy has deployed an amphibious vehicle in numbers we never imagined. Our defense assumed 6 or 8 crossings we could concentrate fire on. Instead, they're crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot hit them all." The British Second Army's attack at Wesel was just as overwhelming. The 15th Scottish Division stormed the river in massive LVT Buffalo amphibious carriers, while the DUKWs hauled their heavy weapons and supplies. By 8 a.m., despite fierce resistance from the German 1st Parachute Army, 3 full Allied divisions were across, complete with vehicles, equipment, and artillery. Then, at 10 a.m., the roar of engines filled the sky. Operation Varsity had begun, the largest single-day airborne assault in history. More than 1,700 transport planes and 1,300 gliders darkened the skies, carrying 16,000 American and British paratroopers. To the men on the ground, it was as if the heavens had opened. Oberlieutenant Franz Weber of the 84th Infantry Division recalled, "The sky turned black with aircraft, then parachutes, thousands of them, blooming like flowers. We thought this was the real attack, and that the river crossings were just a diversion. Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us, in their swimming trucks." The coordination was unlike anything the Germans had seen. The U.S. 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions landed within artillery range of the Rhine crossings, not deep behind enemy lines as before, but right where they could immediately support the river assault. DUKWs, carrying ammunition and medical supplies, drove straight to the paratroopers' landing zones,
a feat that would have required risky airdrops in earlier battles. Now, for the first time, airborne and amphibious forces were moving as one, and together they shattered the last great German defense.
A few days later, wounded paratroopers were being evacuated across the Rhine in ducks, something that would have been impossible in any normal airborne operation. Private First Class Donald Burgett from the 17th Airborne remembered, "We were fighting for this crossroads when these strange-looking truck boats just came rolling out of the woods. No splashing, no getting stuck. They looked like regular trucks, except we knew they'd just come out of the river." Then their crew chief shouted, "Anybody need ammo?" Burgett said they thought they were hallucinating. By noon on March 24th, German commanders realized the duck wasn't just some new trick for crossing rivers. It was a total revolution in how armies handled logistics. Every assumption they'd made about river defenses suddenly meant nothing. Normally, crossing a river was a slow, dangerous process. First, establish a bridgehead, then build a bridge, then start moving supplies. Each phase could be bombed, shelled, or counterattacked. Bridges especially were prime artillery targets, but ducks changed everything. There were no bridges to hit, no choke points to exploit. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, the logistics officer for the 16th Corps, actually set up what he called duck highways across the Rhine. Trucks full of ammo, food, medical gear, and fuel would just drive into the river on one side and drive out on the other, straight to the front lines. No unloading, no transfers, no waiting. Sims said they were running about 50 ducks an hour. Each one carried either 2.5 tons of supplies or 25 soldiers. That's roughly 125 tons of cargo or 1,250 troops every single hour. The Germans kept searching for bridges to bomb, but there were none. Just endless lines of trucks driving through the water. One German paratrooper, Feldwebel Harman Gutz, wrote in his diary, "They have endless vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn a river into a road? We destroy bridges for nothing. They don't even need them." Even supply crews were stunned. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo from the 30th Infantry Division recalled setting up a supply dump 3 miles beyond the Rhine when a duck rolled up, dripping wet, loaded with hot food. The cooks had prepared it on the western bank and sent it straight across, hot coffee and meals delivered right into the middle of a firefight. Russo joked, "The Germans must have thought we were crazy." By March 25th, the situation was unlike anything the German army had ever trained for. The Rhine, that legendary natural barrier, no longer mattered. It hadn't been conquered or breached, it had simply been bypassed by American engineering. That morning, General Alfred Schlemm of the 1st Parachute Army gathered his officers in a farmhouse near Brunnen. From captured records, we know he told them, "Gentlemen, we prepared to fight the last war. We expected them to attack our fortress. Instead, they drove around it." The numbers were staggering. In just 2 days, over 15,000 troops and 1,200 vehicles had crossed the Rhine by ducks, things that would have taken days by traditional bridging. Artillery was already firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence even realized a crossing had happened. Colonel Hinrich von Lüttehau of the 106th Panzer Brigade tried to counterattack near Wesel. His war diary recorded, "Attacked toward the river to destroy enemy bridgehead. Found no bridgehead in the traditional sense. Enemy spread across 15 kilometers, continuously reinforced by swimming vehicles. Impossible to identify a focal point. Attack failed with heavy losses." Meanwhile, the British were seeing similar success. By the evening of March 25th, Scottish divisions had advanced 6 miles inland, supplied non-stop by ducks. Royal artillery spotters even called in fire missions while riding in the amphibious trucks, using their mobility to dodge German counterfire. The Rhine Crossing really exposed the massive industrial gap between America's approach to war production and Germany's. The contrast couldn't have been clearer: American mass production versus German craftsmanship. The Germans did have their own amphibious vehicle called the Landwasserschlepper, or LWS for short. And in many technical ways, it was actually better than the American DUKW. It could carry about 20 soldiers compared to the DUKW's 25, but it had much stronger armor. Its tracked design made it perform beautifully in mud and snow. German engineers had even figured out complex problems like waterproofing the tracks and installing highly reliable bilge pumps. From an engineering standpoint, it was a remarkable machine, smart, sturdy, and efficient. But the problem was scale. Germany built only about 100 LWS vehicles total, and even fewer were ever used in actual combat. Each one needed specialized parts, highly trained craftsmen, and rare materials for the armor and waterproofing. Every unit cost around 75,000 Reichsmarks, about 7 times the price of a DUKW. Meanwhile, General Motors had produced over 21,000 DUKWs, all built using standard truck parts and modern assembly line methods. The DUKW shared its engine, transmission, axles, and dozens of other components with the regular CCKW military truck, of which more than 500,000 were made. That standardization made all the difference. Any mechanic who knew how to fix a regular truck could work on a DUKW. Spare parts were everywhere. Damaged vehicles could be repaired quickly or stripped to keep others running. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, the maintenance chief for the 462nd Amphibious Truck Company, explained the secret behind their success. We kept 90% of our ducts operational throughout the crossing. When something broke, we had the parts. When we didn't, we could just take something from a standard truck and make it fit. Try doing that with one of those specialized German wonder weapons. That production mindset wasn't just about numbers, it was about philosophy. American vehicles were designed to be easy to use. If you could drive a truck, you could learn to operate a DUKW in a few hours. German machines, on the other hand, often required extensively trained crews. The American approach assumed ordinary citizen soldiers, people with minimal training, while the German design philosophy assumed professional soldiers who had trained for months. Personal stories from both sides of the Rhine make this difference come alive. These weren't just abstract statistics or strategic theories, they were real experiences of young men witnessing a technological revolution in warfare. Private First Class James H. of the 89th Infantry Division recalled his first encounter with the DUKWs. He was standing on the West Bank, expecting to pile into assault boats under fire, just like he'd trained. Then, these things that looked like boats with wheels came rolling down the bank. A Navy guy, Navy, right in the middle of Germany, waves us aboard. I asked him, "What the hell is this thing?" He just grinned and said, "Your taxi to Berlin, soldier." The sight of U.S. Navy sailors operating amphibious trucks deep inside continental Europe completely baffled the German troops. Seaman Second Class Robert Moody, who served with the Navy detachment running DUKWs across the Rhine, remembered how captured Germans reacted. They just stared at our Navy uniforms. One who spoke English kept asking, "How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 miles away." He just couldn't make sense of it. German reports from the time show how demoralizing this was. Lieutenant Friedrich Schulzer of the 338th Infantry Division wrote in a letter found after his capture, "They came across the river like it was a street. Not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barges, just driving. Trucks full of soldiers driving through the Rhine. We fired at them, but more kept coming. Always more. Where did they get so many?" Another German, Unteroffizier Paul Braun, captured on March 26, told interrogators, "We were told the Rhine would stop you for weeks, that you'd have to build bridges we could destroy, that your assault boats would be easy targets. Nobody told us about swimming trucks." No one had warned the Germans that the Americans could cross anywhere, anytime. As one soldier later put it, "We prepared for the wrong war."
By March 26, 1945, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the entire German defensive line had collapsed. What German doctrine insisted would take weeks had been achieved in 3 days. The impassable Rhine, which Nazi propaganda had promised would protect the Reich until new negotiations could be arranged, had simply vanished as a defensive barrier. The numbers from those 3 days were staggering. DUKWs completed over 5,000 individual crossings, transporting 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and evacuating 2,000 wounded. Under normal conditions, with traditional bridging operations, it would have taken 2 full weeks and enormous losses to move that much material under fire. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for being overly cautious, achieved total operational surprise through his massive use of amphibious vehicles. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The enemy expected us to cross the Rhine. They did not expect us to drive across it. That distinction proved fatal to their defense." On March 26, General Dwight Eisenhower arrived to see the results himself. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded Ike's reaction. Standing by the river, watching lines of DUKWs shuttling back and forth like a ferry service, Eisenhower turned to General Omar Bradley and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley replied dryly, "The Germans are just figuring that out." By that day, the psychological collapse on the German side was total. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The situation in the West has become impossible. The enemy has crossed the Rhine along a broad front with a new type of amphibious vehicle we failed to anticipate. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." March 27th marked the full exploitation of the Rhine breakthrough. With German defenses in complete disarray, Allied commanders unleashed their mobile forces. The DUKWs, having completed their amphibious mission, revealed another strength. They could function as ordinary trucks once ashore, keeping up with the armored spearheads. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, crossed the Rhine in record time. Tank crews later described the surreal sight of following DUKWs that had just come out of the river, water still dripping off their sides, as they raced down German autobahns. The amphibious trucks brought fuel and ammunition straight to the advancing tanks, eliminating the usual post-crossing delays for bridge building and supply organization. Major General Isaac White, who commanded the 2 armored, reported, "We advanced 50 miles on March 27th alone. In any previous operation, we'd have been waiting for bridges to be finished and for supplies to catch up. Instead, the DUKWs kept pace with us. They crossed rivers we encountered, scouted for new crossing sites, and set up supply points before our main body even arrived." German resistance quickly fragmented into isolated groups. Units trained to counterattack fixed bridgeheads suddenly found themselves surrounded or bypassed by Allied forces that seemed to appear everywhere at once. The rigid German doctrine, built around destroying specific crossing points, simply didn't work when hundreds of amphibious vehicles could make their own crossings wherever they pleased. General Hans von Luck, one of Germany's most respected armored commanders, described his realization in his memoir. Racing toward the town of Dorsten on March 28th, his battalion tried to set up a blocking position only to find American troops already entrenched. "I asked the captured lieutenant how they'd moved so fast," von Luck wrote. "He pointed to a line of those amphibious trucks and said, 'We don't wait for bridges.' That's when I understood Germany hadn't just lost a battle, we'd lost an entire form of warfare." The true significance of the DUKW at the Rhine went far beyond tonnage or numbers. These swimming trucks fundamentally changed the mathematics of river warfare. Traditional crossings focused forces at 1 or 2 points, perfect targets for artillery and airstrikes. But with DUKWs, crossings could happen anywhere along the front, scattering German fire and overwhelming their defenses. German doctrine called for counterattacking bridgeheads before they could be reinforced, but this time there were no bridgeheads, just a steady, continuous stream of amphibious vehicles infiltrating across miles of riverbank. Colonel William Thompson, who oversaw DUKW operations for the U.S. Ninth Army, later summed up the difference. Building a heavy pontoon bridge under fire could take 12 to 24 hours, and during that time, you'd only be able to ferry over maybe a company per hour by assault boat, if everything went right. The DUKWs changed all that. They erased the waiting. We were moving an entire battalion every hour with the DUKWs, right from the very start of the operation. That kind of speed was unheard of in traditional river assaults. But one of the most overlooked effects of the DUKWs was medical. Captain Dorothy Anderson, a nurse with the 45th Field Hospital, described how the system worked. Wounded soldiers were loaded into DUKWs right there on the eastern bank and driven straight across to our hospital on the western side. No vehicle transfers, no waiting for bridges. We were getting men into surgery within an hour of being hit. That just wasn't possible in any earlier river crossing. The DUKWs also made entirely new tactics possible, things no one had ever tried before. Artillery forward observers could quickly relocate by DUKW, constantly shifting positions so German counterfire became useless. Combat engineers used them to haul bridge sections, actually speeding up traditional bridge construction even as those bridges became less essential. Radio operators even turned DUKWs into floating communication hubs, maintaining uninterrupted contact between the two sides of the river. After the war, analysts realized just how deeply German intelligence had misjudged the Americans' amphibious capabilities. The Wehrmacht had seen DUKWs before in Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Normandy, but had completely failed to understand what massing them could mean in a major river operation. General Meyer Heinrich Gehlen, head of Foreign Armies East and later founder of West German intelligence, admitted in his memoirs, "We cataloged American equipment meticulously. We knew about the DUKW. We simply never imagined they would deploy hundreds for a river crossing. Our thinking was limited by our own constraints. Because we could produce only a handful of amphibious vehicles, we assumed the Americans were similarly limited." Captured German intelligence files confirmed this blind spot. A February 1945 report from Army Group H estimated the Allies had just 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles suitable for river operations. In reality, the 21st Army Group alone had more than 2,000. Another report dismissed DUKWs as useful only for post-invasion logistics, after beaches are secured, and unsuitable for assault operations. The failure wasn't just about numbers, it was a complete doctrinal collapse. German intelligence had never identified the specialized amphibious truck companies, never noticed their large-scale training along the Meuse, and never understood that the Allies were rewriting the rules of river warfare. They were preparing to fight the kind of crossing they expected, not the one that actually came. Major Joachim Engelmann, intelligence officer for the 1st Parachute Army, admitted under interrogation, "We studied every Allied river crossing, from the Rapido to the Seine, and believed we understood their methods. The mass use of amphibious vehicles wasn't in our calculations. It was as if they had learned to fly tanks across the river, something beyond our entire frame of reference." Despite the stunning technological and tactical superiority displayed at the Rhine, the crossing wasn't bloodless. The cost, though far less than what traditional assaults would have required, was still heavy. Allied casualties for Operations Plunder and Varsity totaled 6,781 men, 3,968 British and Commonwealth, and 2,813 American. The airborne troops suffered the worst losses. Anti-aircraft fire tore through their formations, with several planes shot down before paratroopers could even jump. The 17th Airborne Division lost 430 men killed in a single day. DUKWs evacuating the wounded were also hit by German artillery. Several were destroyed with all aboard. Oskar Friedensen,
a combat engineer from the 89th Infantry Division, described what his unit went through during the crossing at St. Goarshausen on March 26th. We lost 250 men out of 420 trying to secure our sector. The DUKWs got us across fast, but the Germans were waiting on the high ground with machine guns and mortars. Speed doesn't make you bulletproof. For the Germans, the price was far worse. The 1st Parachute Army was effectively annihilated as a fighting force. Its position shattered, its troops scattered, its commanders in disbelief. The Rhine, once the proud symbol of German defense, had been turned into a highway of defeat.
In the first 72 hours after the Rhine Crossing began, more than 16,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Many simply dropped their weapons once they realized that the fabled Rhine barrier, the one they'd been told was impenetrable, had completely failed. Entire units were cut off when American forces, ferried by ducks, suddenly appeared behind them. Gefreitzer Vera Hoffmann of the 84th Infantry Division was captured on March 25th. During his interrogation, he described how the psychological shock set in. "We held our positions for 2 days, firing at the crossing sites. Then Americans appeared behind us. When we asked prisoners how they'd crossed, they pointed to those swimming trucks. Our lieutenant threw down his weapon and said, 'If they can drive trucks across the Rhine, the war is over.' Nobody disagreed." One of the most extraordinary moments of the entire operation came that same day, March 25, 1945, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on personally crossing the Rhine. This wasn't just for show. Churchill understood what it meant symbolically for Allied troops to cross Germany's sacred river, the historical frontier that for centuries had divided Germany from the West. Accompanied by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, Churchill first observed the crossings from the ruins of a blown-up railway bridge at Wesel. Then, against the frantic objections of his security detail and in direct defiance of Eisenhower's orders, Churchill climbed aboard an American LCVP landing craft and ordered it to take him across. Montgomery's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Trumbull Warren, recorded what happened. The Prime Minister was absolutely determined. He said, "I'm going to cross the Rhine. I've waited years for this moment." The American sailors operating the craft were horrified when they realized who their passenger was, but Churchill was already standing at the bow, cigar clenched between his teeth, flashing his trademark V for victory signs as the boat churned through the water. For 30 minutes, the British Prime Minister stood on German soil east of the Rhine while German artillery shells exploded close enough to pepper the group with debris. Churchill reportedly bent down, scooped up a handful of dirt, and said quietly, "German soil." The crossing had no military necessity, it was dangerous and entirely symbolic, but the psychological impact was immense. The leader of Britain standing, alive and unshaken, on conquered German ground. That moment also highlighted another major advantage of the amphibious operation. Because ducks and landing craft were continuously running back and forth, Churchill could cross without disrupting any supply traffic. In a traditional operation with a single bridge, such a gesture would have required halting critical military movement. The distributed, flexible nature of the duck system made even this bit of political theater possible. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the success of the Rhine crossing accelerated the end of the European war by roughly 3 weeks. The reason wasn't just that the Allies crossed the river, it was how fast and broadly they did it. Amphibious vehicles eliminated the long, dangerous sequence of phases that defined old river crossing doctrine, establishing small bridgeheads, building bridges under fire, gradually reinforcing them, and only then breaking out after stockpiling supplies. That slow process normally took 2 to 3 weeks, giving the enemy precious time to regroup, build new defenses, demolish infrastructure, or negotiate a retreat.
But now, in just 72 hours, 3 Allied armies were already surging into Germany's heartland. The Ruhr, the industrial core of the Reich, was encircled. By April 1st, the advance was moving so quickly that the Germans had no time to destroy their own factories, bridges, or supply depots, which might have prolonged the fight. General Omar Bradley later reflected on the cost that had been avoided. If we'd have had to cross the Rhine the traditional way, assault boats, engineers under fire, gradual reinforcement, we'd have lost at least 50,000 men. The Ducks turned what should have been a bloodbath into a transportation exercise. The strategic effects rippled far beyond the Rhine. News of the crossing's speed and success reached the Soviets, who immediately accelerated their push towards Berlin. Stalin was determined not to let the Western Allies seize the Nazi capital first. The race for Berlin, a race that would define post-war Europe, had effectively begun because of the Ducks' triumph on the Rhine. By March 28, 1945, the German command structure in the West had collapsed. Communications between units broke down completely as headquarters were overrun or fled eastward. The momentum created by the Rhine Crossing made it impossible for the Wehrmacht to mount any coherent defense. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found his forces cut off and trapped in what became the Ruhr Pocket. His final order, issued on March 29th, reflected the utter hopelessness of the situation, an army commander watching his entire command disintegrate before his eyes.
The enemy has achieved the impossible at the Rhine. Further resistance only increases suffering. I release all soldiers from their oath. Save yourselves as best you can. Those were the final words Field Marshal Walter Model issued to his troops on March 29, 1945. 3 weeks later, on April 21st, he took his own life rather than surrender. His suicide marked not just the end of a commander's career, but the psychological collapse of the German army itself. Soldiers who had once fought ferociously for every village now laid down their weapons in droves. For generations, the Rhine had been more than a river. It was a symbol, the mythic shield of Germany. When it fell, so did the illusion that anything could still be saved. Units that might once have resorted to guerrilla warfare simply melted away. Civilian morale, already devastated by relentless bombing, disintegrated completely. The Rhine Crossing had proved beyond question that no natural barrier could defend the Reich. And that realization spread like wildfire. The question echoed through German ranks and towns alike. If the Rhine could be crossed in 3 days, what was the point of fighting on? Local mayors and officials began surrendering their cities to avoid destruction. Even Nazi loyalists felt the despair. Hans Frank, the former governor-general of occupied Poland, wrote in his diary, "The Rhine is crossed. The sacred river that protected Germany for 2,000 years has fallen in 72 hours. If there was any doubt about our fate, it is gone. We face not defeat, but annihilation." The crossing didn't just end a campaign, it transformed military thinking forever. Until March 1945, amphibious assaults were mostly seen as naval operations, beach landings like Normandy or the Pacific Island invasions. The Rhine showed that amphibious warfare could be just as decisive on the continent, deep inside Europe. The U.S. Army's official history later described the mass use of DUKWs at the Rhine as a revolution in military affairs equivalent to the introduction of the tank in World War I. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Treat rivers not as obstacles, but as highways. It changed how armies thought about logistics, maneuver, and operational reach. Even the Soviets, who had observers embedded with Allied headquarters, took careful note. Colonel Ivan Yakushin reported to Moscow, "The Americans have solved the problem of river crossing through industrial mass production.
They built so many amphibious vehicles that rivers became irrelevant. This holds great significance for any future conflict in Europe. The British Army, despite having taken part in the operation, also studied the lessons in detail. Brigadier Richard Goodbody concluded bluntly, "We must never again assume that water barriers provide significant defensive advantage against an enemy with proper amphibious equipment. The Rhine Crossing proves that industrial capacity outweighs geographic advantage." While the generals would later claim the glory, the real credit belonged to the DUKW crews, the sailors, drivers, and mechanics who made the miracle possible. Most were U.S. naval personnel suddenly thrust into the middle of Germany, operating what were essentially slow-moving targets. Seaman First Class Joseph Bernardini of Naval Unit 350 described what a typical crossing felt like. You're driving this big, slow target across 1,300 feet of open water. German 88s are firing at you, mortars are splashing all around you, machine guns trying to find their range. You can't zigzag much, or the current takes you. You just grip the wheel, push the throttle, and pray. Behind the scenes, the maintenance crews performed near miracles to keep the fleet running. Working under fire, often at night, they patched holes, replaced propellers damaged by debris, and fought to keep engines alive despite being soaked in Rhine water. Master Sergeant Thomas Riley of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company recalled, "We were patching holes with whatever we could find, flattened ration cans, bits of German armor, even wooden plugs. If it floated and moved, we kept it running." The British DUKW operators, trained by their American counterparts, also improvised brilliantly. Sergeant Major William Davis of the Royal Army Service Corps invented a way to use the DUKWs for tank crew rescues. "We'd drive right up to burning tanks, use our vehicle as a shield, and pull the wounded aboard. The water dripping off our hull helped with the heat. Saved dozens of lads that way." After the war, German officers conducted exhaustive post-mortems of their defeat. The Rhine Crossing became a case study not just in material failure, but in mental failure, a breakdown of imagination. General Franz Halder, the former chief of the General Staff, wrote in 1948, "We prepared extensively for the Allied Rhine Crossing.
We positioned our reserves, registered our artillery, set up demolitions. We did everything by the book," wrote General Franz Halder, recalling Germany's final stand on the Rhine. "We followed doctrine to the letter. What we failed to imagine was that the enemy would possess hundreds of vehicles that simply ignored the river's existence." That single failure, a failure of imagination, defined the Wehrmacht's collapse. In 1946, a final operational report prepared by imprisoned German officers summarized it bluntly. "The American deployment of amphibious vehicles en masse represents a form of warfare we neither anticipated nor could counter with available resources. Even if we had known in advance, German industry could not have produced comparable numbers. The Rhine was lost in Detroit's factories, not on its banks." It was Colonel General Heinz Guderian, father of German armored warfare, who perhaps captured the truth most clearly. "We Germans perfected the art of warfare. The Americans perfected the business of warfare." At the Rhine, business defeated art. The ducks, those awkward boxy swimming trucks, weren't elegant or beautiful machines. They weren't heavily armored or technically sophisticated, but they worked, and there were thousands of them. That, as Guderian observed, was the American way of war. Practical, industrial, relentless. And yet, despite their decisive role, the Ducks' contribution to the Rhine Crossing was soon overshadowed by flashier stories. The dramatic seizure of the Remagen Bridge, the vast Operation Varsity airborne assault, and Montgomery's textbook ground campaign. But the veterans who were there understood what really made the difference. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower reflected, "Analysts will debate what shortened the war most: strategic bombing, Soviet pressure, or Allied unity. I believe historians underestimate the simple duck. Without it, the Rhine would have been a killing ground.
With it, we drove into Germany like tourists on holiday. After the Rhine, the ducks kept going, across the Elbe, the Danube, and countless smaller rivers. They carried not only soldiers, but survivors. They ferried liberated prisoners from concentration camps too weak to walk, brought food to starving civilians, and delivered supplies to isolated towns. Machines built for invasion became tools of mercy. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company recalled his post-war mission. The same duck that crossed the Rhine under fire was now delivering food to German kids in flooded areas near Hamburg. They'd never seen anything like it, a truck that could swim. They'd chase us shouting, "Schwimmwagen, Schwimmwagen." Funny how something built for war ended up saving lives afterward. The 21,147 ducks produced during the war represented far more than vehicles. They embodied an entire industrial philosophy. While German engineers chased mechanical perfection in small batches, American manufacturers focused on adequate performance in overwhelming numbers. The same factories that built the ducks were also producing 10,000 standard 2.5-ton trucks per month. The steel for their hulls came from mills that turned out Liberty ships every 42 hours. The engines came from assembly lines flexible enough to shift between truck, aircraft, and tank production with minimal retooling. Donald Nelson, chairman of the U.S. War Production Board, once toured a duck assembly line in 1944 and captured the contrast perfectly. In 1 hour, I watched them finish 6 ducks, each one imperfect by German standards. Rough welding, simple fixes, painted olive drab. But each would cross the Rhine. German factories would spend a month building one perfect amphibious vehicle. We built 180 good enough ones in that time. The German Landwasser Schlepper, LWS, though mechanically impressive, revealed the fatal weakness of the German production model. Each vehicle required custom components, skilled hand assembly, and lengthy testing. When Allied bombing disrupted a single supply chain, production halted completely. A missing part meant no vehicle at all. American duck production, on the other hand, was flexible and redundant. If one component ran out, factories substituted another and kept going. The result was unstoppable. A war machine powered not by artistry, but by scale. The success at the Rhine echoed through the final weeks of the war. German soldiers across Europe heard that the Allies had crossed their greatest natural barrier with ease, and morale shattered. In Italy, German troops who had held mountain positions for months suddenly began retreating. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring later admitted, "News of the Rhine crossing caused an immediate collapse in morale. Soldiers asked, if the Rhine cannot stop them, what can? I had no answer." Across Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, isolated German garrisons, still armed but demoralized, began negotiating local surrenders. The myth of the invincible Reich had finally drowned in the waters of the Rhine.
The myth of the impregnable Rhine had long been Germany's last psychological refuge, a symbol of hope that perhaps, somehow, the war could still end in a negotiated peace. But when that sacred river was crossed in just 72 hours, even that illusion collapsed. Resistance now seemed not heroic, but meaningless. Even in Berlin, where Soviet artillery already thundered on the outskirts, the Rhine's fall reverberated. During Hitler's final military conference on April 27th, he reportedly admitted with rare clarity, "The Rhine was lost because we did not anticipate their amphibious capabilities. We prepared for the wrong war." It was, historians agree, perhaps the only accurate military assessment Hitler ever made. 4 decades later, in 1985, surviving veterans of the Rhine Crossing gathered in Lexington, Kentucky, to commemorate those 3 extraordinary days that had broken Nazi Germany's final defense. Gray-haired men, once young soldiers, stood again beside a few surviving DUKWs, the ungainly, rusting relics of an industrial miracle. Former Sergeant James Mitchell,
who had commanded a DUKW in the 819th Amphibious Truck Company, looked up at one of the preserved vehicles and smiled wryly. "Ugly thing, isn't it? Like a boat that mated with a truck and produced something that's neither. But this ugly duckling swam the Rhine when the Nazis thought it impossible. We didn't outfight them, we outproduced them, out-innovated them, out-imagined them." Among the guests was Hans Müller, a former Obergefreiter who had once defended the Rhine as part of the 181st Infantry Division. Now an old man, he addressed the American veterans with remarkable honesty. "You brought swimming trucks to a river battle. We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. The moment I saw those vehicles driving out of the Rhine, I knew the war was over. Not lost, over. You cannot fight an enemy who turns your strongest defense into a highway." The reunion revealed a deeper truth, that the Rhine Crossing success wasn't a triumph of courage alone, or even of battlefield brilliance. It was a triumph of industrial capacity fused with innovation. The real heroes were not only the soldiers who risked their lives under fire, but also the workers on the assembly lines in Pontiac, Michigan, who built the tools that made victory possible. Between March 23 and 26, 1945, something greater than a military operation occurred. It was the triumph of American industrial democracy over German military aristocracy, of mass production over craft perfection, of pragmatic innovation over rigid doctrine. The DUKW itself symbolized that transformation. It wasn't the best amphibious vehicle ever designed, not even close. It was the best that could be mass-produced quickly, cheaply, and reliably with existing tools. It solved problems not through elegance, but through scale, not through perfection, but through practicality. It was driven not by professional soldiers with years of training, but by citizen soldiers who had learned their trade in a matter of days. To traditional German officers, this was horrifying. General von Rundstedt, speaking in British captivity, reportedly complained, "War has become a factory manager's business rather than a general's art. Your swimming trucks were not weapons of war, but products of industry. You defeated us not on the battlefield, but in the factory." Yet that, in the end, was precisely the point. America had industrialized and democratized warfare, just as it had democratized production itself. The DUKW represented not only military ingenuity, but an entire ideology, the belief that with enough organization, imagination, and production, any problem could be solved. The final accounting of the Rhine operation underscored the scale of that achievement. Vehicles involved, hundreds of DUKWs in direct Rhine operations, supported by 600 British Buffalo LVTs with more than 2,000 DUKWs available in theater. German equivalent, only about 100 Landwasserschlepper vehicles ever built, few operational. Operational results, March 23 to 31, 1945. Over 15,000 troops transported across the Rhine, 1,200 vehicles delivered, 3,000 tons of supplies carried, 2,000 wounded evacuated, over 5,000 individual DUKW crossings completed. Production comparison, 21,147 DUKWs built by the United States, 562,750 standard trucks sharing interchangeable DUKW components. Behind each number lay a revolution, a story of how a simple, ugly duckling of a machine turned a mighty river into a road, and with it ended a war.
By the war's end, the numbers told the story better than any speech could.
Germany had built around 100 long Wasserschleppers, none of them specifically designed for river assaults. The United States, by contrast, had produced over 21,000 ducks, with more than 2,000 deployed in the Rhine campaign alone. From the first sketch to the prototype, the duck had taken just 38 days to create. It took 72 hours to breach the Rhine's defenses. The rapid crossing shortened the war by an estimated 3 weeks and spared roughly 50,000 Allied lives that would have been lost in a traditional bridge-building assault. Each duck cost about $10,750, while each German LWS cost 75,000 Reichsmarks, a 7-to-1 advantage in cost and an infinite one in practical deployment. Yet the duck's true legacy went far beyond those figures. It proved that technological surprise in modern war no longer depended on secret wonder weapons, but on the mass application of innovations others failed to take seriously. Germany had dismissed the amphibious truck as a logistical oddity. America had turned it into a strategic revolution. After 1945, militaries around the world absorbed the lesson. NATO's Cold War doctrine made amphibious and river crossing capability a priority across Europe's river-laced terrain. The Soviet Union developed entire families of amphibious transports, inspired by the American success on the Rhine. Today, every major army treats river mobility as standard practice, a direct inheritance of that March 1945 breakthrough. Beyond its military significance, the duck embodied the core of the American production philosophy: quantity over perfection, availability over complexity, reliability over sophistication. It was a worldview that reshaped not only warfare, but post-war civilization itself. The Marshall Plan echoed the duck's logic, rebuilding Europe not with custom-made solutions, but with mass, standardized aid. The interstate highway system translated wartime logistics into national infrastructure. The space race later applied the same principle: favor reliable, mass-produced components over artisanal precision. Perhaps the duck's most profound contribution, however, was psychological. To German soldiers and civilians alike, the sight of Americans driving trucks through the Rhine, through the river that had symbolized Germany's security for 2 millennia, shattered faith in victory. Interviews conducted after the war captured the moment of realization. Frau Elisabeth Becker, who lived near Wesel, recalled, "We heard the artillery on March 23rd, terrible thunder all night. We expected weeks of fighting. Then, on March 26th, American trucks were driving past our house, still wet from the crossing. My father, a veteran of the Great War, looked at them and said, 'When your enemy can drive trucks through rivers, the war is over.'" He was right. That moment of stunned recognition spread across Germany. Resistance faded not just because of military defeat, but because of technological obsolescence. The dawning realization that a nation built on engineering precision had been overtaken by one built on industrial imagination. Winston Churchill, who had personally crossed the Rhine during the operation, later wrote in his memoirs, "The Rhine crossing of March 1945 marked not merely the breach of Germany's last barrier, but the triumph of a new form of warfare. The Americans, with their amphibious trucks, had solved through industry what we Europeans had solved through strategy. They did not defeat the Rhine, they ignored it." I watched those ungainly vehicles, part boat, part truck, wholly effective, streaming across waters that had guarded Germany since the days of Rome. Each duck was a messenger of doom for Nazi Germany, carrying not just soldiers, but proof of American industrial supremacy. He went on, "In my long life, I have seen many military innovations, the machine gun, the tank, the airplane. But few impressed me as much as those simple swimming trucks. They represented not technological brilliance, but organizational genius, not German-style perfectionism, but American-style pragmatism. When I stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine that March day, watching ducks crawl from the river like primordial beasts rising from the sea, I knew I was witnessing not just the end of a war, but the beginning of the American century. 6 weeks later, on May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. In his post-war explanations, buried among discussions of bombing campaigns and Soviet advances, he made a quiet but telling admission that the enemy's unexpected amphibious capabilities at the Rhine had decisively broken German resistance. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander echoed that view. No single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. And so the duck, ugly, improvised, and unstoppable, became more than a vehicle. It became a symbol of an age when victory was no longer won by the sharpest sword or the boldest charge, but by the hum of assembly lines, the rhythm of factories, and the simple faith that good enough multiplied by 1,000 beats perfect built once.
It turned rivers from obstacles into highways, transformed logistics from a limitation into an advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, perhaps even months. The last operational DUKW crossing of the Rhine took place on May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany's surrender. That final run carried no soldiers or weapons, only food supplies for German civilians stranded in areas cut off by destroyed bridges. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, the man behind the wheel of that last DUKW, later recalled, "No shooting, no artillery, just driving across like it was a Sunday cruise. German kids were waiting on the eastern bank, hoping we had chocolate. 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing food. That's what those ducks did, turned the impossible into routine, enemies into people who needed help." The Rhine Crossing of March 1945 stands as one of the great turning points in military history, not merely because of its tactical or strategic success, but because of what it represented. The humble DUKW, ungainly, unarmored, and unglamorous, had rendered obsolete a barrier that had protected Germany for over 2,000 years. The German defenders had prepared for every contingency their doctrine could imagine, except for the one that truly mattered: that American industry could produce over 21,000 vehicles that made rivers irrelevant. They had prepared for the wrong war, not out of ignorance or incompetence, but because they could not imagine a rival whose greatest weapon was its factories. The Rhine was not conquered, it was industrially obsoleted. The hundreds of DUKWs that churned through the Rhine between March 23 and 31, 1945, carried more than soldiers and supplies. They carried proof that industrial mass production could overturn the oldest assumptions of military strategy. Every German soldier who saw a DUKW crawl up the eastern bank witnessed the death of traditional warfare's limits. Field Marshal Montgomery, never one for poetic understatement, captured it perfectly. "We didn't assault the Rhine, we commuted across it." That simple line described the deeper truth of the operation. The DUKW had transformed the extraordinary into the routine, the impossible into the practical. The crossing demonstrated that in modern warfare, industrial capacity, properly applied, could achieve what even military genius could not. The Wehrmacht, perhaps the most tactically skilled army in history, was defeated not by superior battlefield brilliance, but by a fleet of swimming trucks built on Detroit assembly lines. In the end, the German defenders were right about one thing: the Rhine could not be crossed against determined resistance by traditional means. What they never imagined was that America's factories would make traditional means irrelevant. The DUKWs that swam the Rhine in March 1945 carried not just soldiers, they carried the future of warfare, a future where industrial power outweighed geography,
where mass production surpassed craft perfection, and where pragmatic innovation triumphed over rigid doctrine. The final lesson of the Rhine was not military, but industrial. In the total wars of the 20th century, victory no longer belonged to the finest generals or bravest soldiers. It belonged to the best factories. The German defenders never imagined the Americans could possess such abundance, not because of bad intelligence, but because they couldn't conceive of such industrial plenty. That blindness, more than any tactical error, doomed the Third Reich's last stand on its sacred river. The DUKW didn't just cross the Rhine. It crossed the line between the old world and the new, between warfare as art and warfare as industry.